Great. So moving on, we're going to start our last session of the Lighting Talks. So, and we have a great diversity of topics coming up, so it sounds exciting. And I swear that I'm not biased in the next presentation because I'm going to be introducing Dr. Maria Nieves, who is a postdoc in my lab. But it's really a great pleasure to have you speaking today, Maria. So she's an anthropology by training, but has a lot of experience in molecular biology techniques, ancient DNA, population genetics. She's an NSF postdoc, postdoctoral fellow, jointly appointed at ASU with Adam Stone and together in our lab in Mexico, in LANGEBIO. So she's going to talk, I mean, she has many different projects in population genetics, but today I think she's going to talk about the Lesser Antilles Afro-Caribbean Population Diversity Project. Thank you, Maria.
Okay, thank you, everyone. So, is this working? Maybe? Yes. Okay, so the Antilles, also known as the Caribbean Islands, which are located here, were the first region of the Americas to receive a large group of enslaved Africans who were forcibly transported as part of the Atlantic slave trade, which in this part of the world started in the 16th century. Now, the nature and the volume of the slave trade varied across the region of the Caribbean, but we estimate that about 7 million African peoples were forcibly extracted from their homes and brought to this part of the Americas during this time. Now, because the nature of the slave trade was so varied, we see that the experiences of the Afro-descendant communities that formed on each island and also their cultural expressions are also quite heterogeneous. Now, we suspect that in such a way, the genomic diversity or the genomic landscape of Afro-Caribbean peoples is also quite varied. But unfortunately, these communities remain quite understudied and a bit excluded from human population genetics. So what our project is trying to do is to work together with anthropologists to provide a genomics perspective towards reconstructing the Afro-Caribbean experience. Now, specifically what we're doing is we're working with Dr. Jada Torres at Vanderbilt with a sample of 5 self-identified Afro-descendant communities in the former British colonies of St. Kitts, St. Lucia, St. Vincent, Grenada, and Trinidad. And we have a large sampling of DNA from these communities, and we've genotyped them using the Illumina Mega X array. And we are now in the process of looking at genetic ancestry, structure, and variation by comparing the genotypes from these samples to large continental reference panels. And so, for instance, here I'm showing you a very basic global ancestry plot generated in admixture, model of K = 5 ancestral populations. And if we zoom into the far end of the plot, here are Afro-Caribbean populations here, we see that all of our communities have a very large proportion of African ancestry. This is what we would expect based on their ethnic self-identification. But what I want to point out here is how heterogeneous these profiles really are. So we have some communities that have sort of a classical two-way pattern of admixture, African and European ancestry. So this is kind of what we would expect. And we have other communities, especially Trinidad, for instance, where Afro-Caribbean peoples have inputs from up to 5 continental regions to their autosomal ancestry. And one thing that really jumped out to us is that in Trinidad, for instance, we have a fairly high proportion of East and South Asian ancestry. This is a pattern that's really different from what we see in the rest of the Caribbean, if we think about Caribbean Latinos, for instance, or even other Afro-descendant populations. But if we look to the historical record to contextualize some of these findings, it actually makes a lot of sense. So we know that Trinidad was a center for Indian and Chinese diaspora starting in the 19th century because the British Crown, at the time their colonial overseer, was bringing indentured laborers from this part of the world to replace the labor of newly freed African slaves. So what we're looking at when we see this pattern is that these more recent migrants who came just a few generations ago are in some way participating in or being integrated into the formation of modern-day Afro-descendant communities. So that was quite interesting. But beyond global ancestry, we're also interested in using the genomic data to look at where within these continental regions do the ancestors of present-day Afro-Caribbean peoples come from? Where within Africa or Asia or Europe do they come from? And to do that, we're using a technique called ancestry-specific PCA. And what this allowed us to do is to isolate chromosomal segments that of, say, African ancestry, for instance, from the genomes of our admixed individuals, and then compare them to large panels of reference variation using principal components analyses. And when we did this, looking at African ancestry, what we found was that those pieces of the genome of our admixed Afro-Caribbean peoples that were mapping to Africa, which I'm showing you in this PCA in the black dots here, cluster with present-day peoples who live in an area of Africa known as Lower Guinea. And this is an area that includes the modern-day nations of Ghana, Togo, Ivory Coast, and Benin. But during the slave trade period, this region was known variably as the slave, ivory, or gold coast, depending on what was being exported out there. People who live there today include the Yoruba and the Yakuba, for instance. If we look to the historical record, we can see that between 2 to 3 million humans were forcibly extracted from this part of the world and specifically brought to the British colonies in the Americas, including many of the islands that we are studying today. So it makes quite a lot of sense that some, at least, of the African ancestry we see in these communities may derive from this part of Africa. Now, in addition to looking at African ancestry, we're also interested in using these techniques to trace the origins of other potential ancestors. Where within Asia, where within Europe or the Americas did these ancestries come from? And so right now we're in the process of completing an analysis looking at South Asian ancestry, and what we're finding is that there seem to be ancestries that may come from different parts of this Indian subcontinent. Specifically, we're finding that South Asian ancestry in our admixed Afro-Caribbeans clusters with peoples who today live in southern India and Bangladesh. Now, this isn't exactly consistent with what we know from the historical record, so we're still working on this and seeing if perhaps we can uncover origins that perhaps people just haven't studied in the historical record. So overall, what our study is finding is that there's a very large impact of post-colonial or historic migrations in the formation of the genomic and cultural diversity of present-day Afro-Caribbean peoples. And by understanding how these communities came to be using the genetic data, we are also attempting to look at restoring or reconstituting some of these links that may have been severed through histories of forced migration and slavery. And of course, another big intent of this project is to help increase representation of historically marginalized communities within human population genetics. And with that, thank you, and I'll take any questions.
Who raised the hand? No? Questions? Oh, who's closer? Wait.
So Maria, do you have any information about the ancient DNA from Puerto Rico, and just to compare with the current data?
So we have ancient genomes from Puerto Rico that are pre-contact, but the Native American ancestry component is very, very low for these communities, actually. So I'm not entirely sure. Oh, sorry. I was going to try to go back to the admixture plot. I'm not entirely sure we're going to be able to say that much. This is blue component here. So we haven't yet tried to make that comparison, but I'm not entirely sure we're going to have enough data to make it, actually. But we could also compare with current living indigenous people who live in the Caribbean today. There is some data available for them. And in fact, I will say that the two islands that have the highest Native American ancestry component are also islands where there are Native peoples who live today. So it's interesting.
Who was next, I think, here?
So I was wondering if the communities that you are working with have expressed interest or historical identity of this forced migration, and if this African part is still important in their culture. And if I can do a second question, the ancestry specific, well, the local ancestry, you do it with PCA. Is that the same as ChromoPaint protocol, or does it differ methodologically?
So the first question is, all the people that are included in the study are self-identified Afro-something. So they would self-identify as Afro-Caribbean or Negro or Afro-descendant, whichever term they choose to use. So they're all self-identified as Afro-descendants, and yes, they do culturally express that in whichever way they prefer. I didn't do the sampling, Jada did the sampling, but that was how the sampling was designed. The IAS-PCA is done, so first we do local ancestry using RFMix, and then we use a pipeline. So we literally just mask the rest of the genome that we're not interested in. So if we're looking at African ancestry, we'll only look at those pieces, and then we'll compare that with the reference panel. So that's how we do it. Yeah.
Ready? Okay. Okay, really quick. Great talk. Do you think, you mentioned that there's like a founder population from China and Trinidad, which someone told me recently, but do you think you could connect it to a particular region in China?
This is what we want to do next, actually. So I only showed the Africa and South Asia SPCA, but we're currently working on Europe, the Americas, if we can get enough, and Asia. So this is exactly what we want to go do next, but I don't know yet. Thank you.